Shavua Tov, and it's a Shavua Tov Me'od this week. We can say Baruch HaTov Hamitiv. Blessed is Hashem who is good and makes things good, because a son Nasrallah, a great tzorer of Am Yisrael, a scourge of Am Yisrael, has been eliminated from the world, Baruch Hashem, by our fighting forces. Kadosh Baruch Hu blessed us to succeed in this mission to avenge the deaths of many Jews and the many other innocent people whose blood was on his hands from the many years that he was here in this world, causing mayhem and destruction. And it's an appropriate time, I think, while thanking Hashem for being good and making good, to ask how the Torah understands the meaning of the words Tov and Ra, what are often translated as good and evil. And I don't think that we'll want to argue that there's no sense in which the word Tov means what we often translate as good, and there's no sense in which Ra means what we translate as bad or evil. But it is somehow more complicated than that when you start really looking at the context of usage of these words. And in some ways, it must be, because if we had too simple a notion of good and bad or good and evil in the language of the Torah, then it would be hard to understand why the Torah was not teaching us a kind of dualism, right? If you want, you can talk about the world as though it's divided into some kind of cosmic battle between good and evil, as other ideologies have done, famously Zoroastrianism. And there even is kind of a temptation to make the mistake of thinking that's what the Torah is talking about in Gan Eden, in the story of the Garden of Eden, which has all of these elements of a kind of a mythic situation where there's this special garden, a sort of divine garden where there's a special tree and a dragon or a reptile guarding it, and all of these elements that you see not in the Torah, but in other Mediterranean or ancient Near Eastern attempts to tell a story about a sort of garden of the gods. And I don't want to suggest for a second that the Torah should just kind of be held alongside these other stories. It's aware of that genre, as it is of many genres, and it explodes or parodies them in making its own point about what the correct way of looking at things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to look at things as is. And so I don't think it's a problem for us in any sense that Gan Eden represents some of those other stories, resembles some of those other stories. But what is true is that when, as a child or as so to speak, a recently converted pagan, if we read Gan Eden and we hear about a tree, and it's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, we just slip into the idea of, oh yeah, of course there's good and evil, and of course I want to be good and I want to do good, and of course the Torah must be telling me that my job is to do good and to be good, and that somehow I should be at the same time against all that which is bad or all that which is evil, and that's my job, right? But we even, in what we just read in the Parashah, in Parashat Nitzavim, you can start to see how this gets more complicated in the Torah, which it should, right? It must get more complicated because Hashem is one, right? There isn't a cosmic battle between good and evil that's raging between equal powers, one of which might win over the other. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is above all of it, and he created all of it, right? Yeshayahu Navi, in Hashem's name, says of Hashem that he is Oseh Shalom Uvoreh Ra. He creates, he makes peace, and he creates Ra, whatever Ra is, evil or bad. But the point is that he makes everything, he controls everything, he is above everything. He's not a combatant on the good side against the forces of evil. And you start to see that also in Parashat Nitzavim, because we have this choice at the end, nearly at the end of the Torah, where Moshe is talking to Bnei Israel and says, "Re'eh natati lefanecha hayom et ha'chaim ve'et ha'tov ve'et ha'mawet ve'et ha'ra." See, I've set before you this day life and good and death and ra, or evil. And then we go down to a few more psukim. Ha'idoti bachem hayom et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz ha'chaim ve'ha'mawet natati lefanecha ha'bracha ve'ha'klala v'harta b'chaim lema'an tehiyeh ata u'ezara'echa. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that both you and your seed may live. So we have good and bad, and blessing and curse, and life and death, and we choose life. We don't doesn't say and choose good. There are other psukim we'll get to where we talk about good, but there's something a little bit already. I don't know if troubling is the word, but it would you might have thought choose good and you will have life and blessing. Right? That might have been a natural thing to say instead of choosing evil and then you will have death and curse. But it doesn't say that. It just says choose life, and the Torah is the means to choosing life. And Tov and Ra are there, and so are Bracha and Klala. And of course, we know that keeping the Torah is supposed to lead somehow to Bracha. But is that because it's good or because it's the Torah? And is it always good to keep the Torah, or is it sometimes Ra? It's all very unsettled when we talk about this particular passage. And I think we have to, at the outset, recognize that that must be deliberate, and at some level, the Torah is trying to avoid being Greek about this, right? Because the Greek thing, the Platonic dialogue kind of thing, would be to say, oh, let's ask the question, is it the case that doing that which is pleasing to the gods is the same thing as doing that which is good? Or, is it the case that it's good because it's pleasing to the gods, or is it the case that the gods are pleased by it because it's good? And all of those kinds of back and forth that you can have if you're trying to be Greek and sort of just pick things to pieces without putting anything usefully back together in the manner of the Platonic dialogue. It's not fair, I guess, to tar Aristotle with the same brush. He's a bit better for us, as Rambam or Maimonides greatly appreciated. But in any case, the need to philosophize about the nature of the good and whether it is identifiable with that which the divine commands us or not, is a kind of fetish of Greek thought that the Torah wants to deal with in a different way. It wants to deal with it in law and in narrative, and you will get a subtler and more sophisticated understanding of how these different things lock together, because clearly it is somehow necessary to connect serving Hashem with the idea of good. And on the other hand, exactly that which is good or bad, clearly we're not, at the end of the day, told to just go and do that which is good without the Torah to guide us. So what does this all add up to? So those are some opening kinds of thoughts or questions. Now I think it just helps to look at a lot of different sources, right? There's a lot of different places where the word Ra is used, where the word Tov is used. And in rapid fire, I'll just refer to them. We won't read through all of them so that we can make a generalization that we can start to present evidence for quickly. What I want to argue about Tov and Ra is that while they contain the element of what we think of as the simple meaning, obviously there's a sense in which Tov is desirable and what things one should do, or things one likes, and Ra is not desirable, or things one doesn't like, or things one perhaps shouldn't do. But at the end of the day, it's more complicated in each case, and I think we can see that by just laying out a theory of what each of them is about, and then pointing at a bunch of sources that maybe hangs together in each case. So first of all, with Tov, what is Tov about? Tov, I would want to argue, is about the potential that something has to become that which is desirable from the perspective of an individual, right? So we first hear about Tov when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is creating the world. Vayar ki tov, right? He saw that it was good. All of these different instances where HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates something in the 7 days of creation, and he sees that it's good. And when he creates everything, then it says he saw it was Tov Me'od. And we already have to recognize that there's something. It starts with light, first of all. It's all about seeing. He saw that it was good. The first thing that's good is the light. And so it's about the connection between where you are and where you could be or what's far away from you. Light is about providing you with information about where you are not. You see things from far off. And also, when you're talking about creating the whole world, of course, it has something to do with potential because when you look at the world as it is and you say it's Tove, if that's what Tove means, Tove can't mean it's all happy sunshine and friendliness and things that are beautiful and things that are, it's a mess. The world is complex. The world has pain and suffering, and it has animals devouring each other, and it has lots of things that are disgusting and lots of things that are decaying and rotting. And when you add that all up and you just say, well, that's the created world, it's Tove. Clearly, it has to, at some level, be about where it's headed, right? That what's on its way to becoming is the sense in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees the good in it, right? Because his intention is for the world to serve a purpose and to have a point and to have something that it evolves towards and develops towards. And it can't be the case that it's equally good, at any point, but rather that it progresses. That's why it's Tov Me'od when it's all created, that there's a progression towards greater good as it develops. So Tov is about perspective and the judgment of an individual, and also about maybe like potential and the use of it or the point of it, where it's headed. And I think that especially the point about perspective has to be emphasized because Tov sometimes is used to talk about things that are very wicked in Tanakh, right? Because if it's Tov be'enav, if it's good in his eyes, that's just saying really that someone desires something. They want it to be the case. They're intending something. So Tov can just be the subjective judgment of an individual. And there's the famous pasuk at the end of the book of Judges, that there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was good in his eyes. And of course, that's not a statement of, oh yeah, it was all good. On the contrary, it's talking about what chaos and wickedness there was. But if everyone does what's Tov be'enav, what's good in his eyes, then that's what that leads to. So Tov can be Tov be'enei Hashem, can be good in the eyes of Hashem, but it can also be good in the eyes of someone else who's not Hashem. And that may be part of where the problem comes up with Tov. And what would be a problem with saying, go do Tov, go be good, because good in whose eyes? And how do you know that, right? So Tov, in a sense, is simpler in terms of what it actually means. You could make something more complicated out of it still, but I don't think you have to go elaborately into many sources in order to establish this. Lots of people in Tanakh, it's basically they see something, it says, and they saw that it was good or it was good in their eyes, and it's a judgment of its potential. It's a judgment of what it could become, like Yocheved looking at Moshe as a baby. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu looking at the world that he created. See if we can pull up the one about Yocheved looking at the baby, right? So what is it? Yeah. ותהר האישה ותלד בן ותראה אותו כי טוב הוא ותצפנהו שלושה ירחים. And the woman conceived and she bore a son and she saw that he was good or tov and she hid him for 3 months, right? So it's all pretty simple. People look, they see, they make a judgment, and then that determines something of their action because of some potential or possibility that they see. Now, Ra, of course, at times, it's very easy to see it as being connected with bad or evil, especially when you look at it in particular contexts, like, for example, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was about to wipe out the world with his Mabul, his flood, it says, "Vayar Adonai ki rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz v'chol yetzer machshavot libo rak ra kol hayom." And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of his thoughts and his heart was only evil continually. So we could go back and ask whether evil was really the word there, because I'm not sure that translation really works here, but it works insofar as we say, okay, he's about to wipe out the earth. because these people are doing bad things. And we hear more in detail elsewhere that they are doing bad things. It keeps saying they do Hamas, the wickedness or the sort of violent criminality, or however you want to translate Hamas, is a more clearly identified thing. And so it seems natural to say, okay, so the world was all evil. But really, we know it was all Ra. And I think we have to already kind of ask the question, if the world was really all Ra, what do we mean by that? Do we mean every single thing that anyone did was just evil? That starts to, if we use the kind of movie theater definition of evil, that starts to sound comic and silly, right? That when a child drinks a glass of water, is that also evil because everything was evil? Everyone only thought evil all the time, that it was all this sort of cackling, mad desire to do cruelty and wickedness. Something about the mere fact that everything was Ra already kind of causes us to ask whether Ra really means what we think it does here. And yet, it still at least makes sense that Ra is what Hashem wipes out most of humanity for. And so at some level, it still fits. So that's one example. It's also the case that in Stone, right? That Stone was this place where everyone was doing bad things. And so it says, "Anshe Stom ra'im v'hata'im ladonai me'od." The men of Stone were exceedingly wicked and sinners before the Lord, right? So again, we say ra'im is wicked because we follow on with their hata'im, they're doing the wrong thing. But it's still a question, okay, so how do we translate this word? So now what I want to argue for with Ra is that really Ra is something that has more to do with perspective like Tove than we maybe at first thought. And it's certainly substantiated by the fact that there are many examples where people say, oh, this is bad in my eyes, or Ra in my eyes, or when it is, for example, bad in Avram's eyes that Yishmael has to be sent away. It says, "Vayira hadavar me'od ba'inei Avraham al odot beno," right? So it's somehow bad in his eyes to send away Yishmael. It also is bad in Moshe's eyes when the people are demanding meat, and Moshe somehow doesn't know how he's going to get meat for them in Kibbutz Tawa, and so it says that it's bad in his eyes, also using the word, the root of Ra. So it is partly just that there are a lot of attributions of this judgment from vision, but I think also think about just all these different words. You can get it a little bit by doing the sort of anagrams and wordplay. Ra means Ra, and then there's Re'eh, which is your fellow, and there's Ro'eh, which is a shepherd, and then there's which means awake, and there's Ir, which means a city. There's Ya'ar, which means a forest. And that sounds like a completely unrelated collection of things at first. But I think the common thread that you can find there is some sense of collective awareness, right? That if you have a forest and a city, it's about collections of people or collections of trees. So it's about a group. A ro'eh is a shepherd. So he's someone who sort of takes the whole flock of sheep and moves it around together. And a re'eh, your fellow, like ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, your fellow is another person. So it's you and a group of people. And is awake, but it's like aware, meaning you're awake, you share the world of the waking with other people who are awake, whereas when you're asleep, you're dreaming and no one knows what you're dreaming. So it's about objectivity, actually. I think a very provocative translation of Ra is objectivity, which doesn't sound evil at all at first. It sounds necessary and useful. And it is necessary and useful for people to what? To look at the world and try to make sense of it in a way that focuses on that which seems the same to everyone and where they can compare notes and agree. It's sort of about the basis of science to some degree. It's about saying, all right, what do you see? What do I see? Oh, it seems we see the same thing. And now we can start to talk about what's predictable about what we see. And we can talk about the fabric of the world and how it works and make sense of it and make use of it. And it seems like something where you kind of need to do that in order to get around it. It's even maybe part of doing mitzvot to do those things. And we can maybe get to the idea of Yetzer Hara and how Chazal talk about it. Ayin Hara, Lashon Hara, like there's lots of things that are Ra. But before doing that, just thinking more about what we get from the Torah, I think the point is when you now go around and you look at all the uses of Ra in the Torah, I think you can argue that it is possible to think of this first and foremost as being about the collective objective perspective having a hold on how someone views their situation. And the text is often demonstrating how wickedness creeps in, or how at least a dismal view of things creeps in. Like whether something's bad or evil, whether it's that you don't like its potential or that you're going to do wrong, both of those things come from an excess of objectivity, because the excess of the objective perspective is that it's going to show you a world in which there are just hard constraints that you can't get around, right? There's only enough food for me and not for you. And so now I have to kill you because otherwise I'm going to starve. Or this boat looks raw. It looks like a bad boat. It looks like a boat that's going to sink. And there's no way I can do what I need to serve Hashem or to do the right thing because I don't have the means. And so, you agree that there's a hole in the boat and he agrees that there's a hole in the boat. The boat will definitely sink. There's no way around it. And so it's sort of the weight of objectivity against the ness, against the miracle, but also against the sort of the faith in Hashem that would allow you to be generous. So it is at one level going to lead to people being abusive of each other or exploitative of each other, right? Like we can't both live. I need to work you to death so that I can eat. That kind of ra, right? There's a lot of ra talking in, Paro. Paro has the word ra in his name. And he says to Bnei Israel, when they're trying to leave Mitzrayim, and he says, you can't take the children. He uses the word ra'u, like that it's evil or it's bad against your plan to take the children out of the desert, saying it's sort of impossible to survive with children in the desert. It is Ra in Moshe's eyes when he doesn't know where to get meat from because he suddenly feels like he's tapped out and he doesn't know how to connect with the wondrousness of what Hashem can provide anymore. And so he's talking sunken down in reality. How am I supposed to provide meat in the middle of a desert? So it's sort of about a sense of the impossible, which leads to a sense of scarcity, which leads to a sense of, I'm going to exploit you. I'm going to work you to death in order for, my survival to be ensured, all those different things. So whether it's about the insufficiency itself or whether it's about how you treat people as a result, there is a connection with all of these negative things, what's bad or what's evil, or what we often translate as such in English. But when Hashem says he's borei ra, right, he creates ra, what does ra mean in the world? And when there's a etz da'at tov or ra, when there's a tree of knowledge of tov and ra, now we understand that ra and tov are both about perspective, but tov can be tov b'nei Hashem, and then it's about the potential that Hashem sees in a situation or a thing. And then there's a kind of ultimate purpose that we're talking about. So Hashem can look at all of creation and say it's tov, or there's tov b'nei someone else, and then it's about the purpose he sees in it, and he might, be very wrong to see the purposes that he sees in it, and then tov is not worth so much. So tov is less good than we think of it as. And Ra is not as bad as we think it is, because Ra is, well, look, sometimes I need to ask other people what they see and I need to compare notes with them. And really, if I don't do that, then I'm in this hallucinatory world of subjectivity that I don't really have solid ground to step on it. I need to navigate the world using Ayin Hara, where we all count the grain together and see how much there is. Sometimes we need to do things like that. Counting people, notably, is associated with the idea of Ayin Hara, right? But that doesn't mean that you're physically harming people by counting them necessarily. But what it might mean is that in order to count them, you kind of need to collect data and go around from person to person in ways that either might spread disease or that would allow you to notice that there is a disease already afflicting people and that their numbers are shrinking, right? All these things about collecting data and making it objective by counting, there is a despondency or an immediate kind of sense of depression that you might feel from seeing that Ra, seeing things through that Ain Hara. But the Ra is not itself evil in the sense of the Hamas of the people on earth when everything was Ra'im, when everything was Ra in the time of Noach. Ra might have just meant, and now it starts to make sense, right? Everything was Ra. All they had was what is possible, what seems feasible based on the data that I have, right? This way of surviving in the world by taking it through the eye of what seems objectively possible and then deciding my only choice is to stab this person to death with a stick so that I can take his crumb because there's no other crumbs to eat, right? So the Hamas comes after the Ra. It's Rak Ra, so everyone can be drinking their glass of water and it can be Ra because they're thinking only in terms of some Ain Hara with which they're viewing everything. But what that leads to is Hamas. What that leads to is violent criminality in the case of people in the time of Noah. Or in the case of Stone, notice that the people are not just Ra'im. They're Ra'im ve'hata'im, right? So they are Ra'im, whatever that means, and they're sinning. So the sinning follows from the Ra'im, but the Ra'im itself isn't necessarily clearly synonymous with that. There's something different, right? And clearly the people of Stone, they're very concerned about who's being allowed to eat the food here, right? It is about tracking. It's about let's all show up. The whole city shows up to the door to demand to know who is inside the house. It's about objectivity, right? It's about the perspective of the collective and demanding that all the data be gathered. And then once those data are gathered, it turns out that when you ask the mob what they want to do with that data, it's wickedness, right? So Resha, wickedness, is not the same thing as Ra. And it isn't interesting, actually. I think it's the kings of Sdom and Amorah that are Bera and Bersha, right? So you have Bera and Beresha. You have Ra and Resha. So Resha, yes, is wickedness, is doing things that Hashem sees as sinful and being someone who would do those things. But Ra is something that goes back to Eden, and it's something more general, and also maybe something that is not so easy to eliminate. Like there's a Gemara that talks about, they tried to get rid of Yetzer Hara, all the sages or Anshe Knesset Gudolah or whatever. I think they boil it at some point. It's like a little monster that comes out of the Kodesh Kodeshim. I'm not going to relay the whole Gemara accurately from memory, so one can study it. But when they get rid of it, then eggs stop hatching, right? There's a problem, like the world doesn't work anymore without Yetzer Hara. And in that context, maybe we think of it as, well, there's the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, and there's a Yetzer Hara for Giluei Arayot, for sexual impropriety or whatever. And so it's easy to just glide by it and be like, oh, well, yes, they got rid of sexuality and now the eggs aren't hatching. But there's another sense in which more generally, like you can't get rid of Ra and have the world work properly, because Ra is not the evil we want to vanish from the world. Ra is the objectivity of the hard constraints of how the world seems to work that cause people to be selfish, that cause people to be stingy, that cause people to steal, that cause people to take from others so they can serve their own interests and everything else that you build on top of that. And so when we put those two things together, it's interesting now to think, among other things, about what that means for Gan Eden. And I'm not sure I have a good answer for that yet. There's Tov and there's Ra, and there's a tree, fruit, that you eat it, and it's maybe gives you or represents Da'at Tov Ra, right? It's knowledge of Tov and Ra, of good and bad, or however you want to translate those words. But it clearly is something that we are meant to associate in part with what we think of as the sort of normal translations of good and bad, at least insofar as there are aspects of Tov and Ra that sometimes in the way that they're used, that they seem to be judgments of the quality of something that we need to be able to make in the world. So, for example, there is in Sefer Yirmiyahu an instance. Let me see if I can find this pasuk. In Sefer Yirmiyahu, there is this vision given to Yirmiyahu of a basket of figs, where he says, Hadud ehad te'enim tovot me'od, ki te'enei habakuroth, v'hadud ehad te'enim ra'ot me'od, asher lo te'achalna mero'a. So one basket had very good figs, like the figs that are ripe, first ripe, and the other basket had very bad figs, which were so bad they could not be eaten. So this, it has to be acknowledged. First of all, this connects us right back to Eden, or Eden. So it's right back to Eden. It's about figs, right? Figs are what Adam and Chava cover themselves up with after they eat from the fruit. So figs are a fruit. When you eat the fruit, this is talking about eating fruit and whether you can eat the fruit or not. And it's talking about figs, and it's talking about Tov and Ra. It's all Eden stuff. It's all connecting to the moment of eating the fruit of Da'at Tov and Ra. So this is commenting for us in Yirmiyahu and Navi to some degree about what the words Tov and Ra mean. And if we read this pasuk in Yirmiyahu, it reminds us that, okay, we need the word Tov to kind of mean just good as we think of it. Like, this is a good fruit, meaning I can eat it and I would benefit from it. It would taste good. It would nourish me. Or this is a bad fruit. It would taste bad. It would poison me, right? That there is some judgment of, I want this, I don't want that has to be threaded through so that, yes, it's Da'at Tov Ra is about judgment of quality. It's about a person having Da'at, having knowledge, such that they believe they can judge what is good and what is bad. So I don't mean that we're trying to sweep away totally the notion that there's such a thing as Ra being bad, like bad, I don't want it. It's just that we also need to recognize that there's this deeper background to Ra when we talk about it as the fabric of creation, where it's about objectivity, it's about the nature of things, and it's not something you can eliminate from the world or that you would want to eliminate from the world. And on the flip side of that, I think what's also true with Tov is that clearly the Torah, as we started out with Nitzavim, does want kind of to say Tov is a thing that's parallel to keeping the Torah or doing the right thing, right? Because we have all this, I said before you, blessing and curse and life and death and good and bad. Now choose life, but clearly blessing and good are also kind of parallel to that, and you're sort of meant to understand that you're choosing those things as well. Not only that, but the Torah elsewhere tells you that you should do good, right? So there are two famous psukim. So one of them is here. It's about a Tove Yashar or a Yashar v'Atov. There are two different psukim. So one of them says, "Ve'asita hayashar ve'atov be'inei Adonai lem'an yitav lech uvata v'yirashta et ha'aretz hatova asher nishba Adonai lavotecha." So you should do that which is straight and good in Hashem's eyes, in order that it will be good for you, and you will come and inherit this land, this good land that Hashem swore to you and your fathers. So this is saying you should do that which is straight and good in Hashem's eyes. But it's interesting. There's a few things that are kind of interesting here. One is that it doesn't say asita et hayashar ve'et hatov. It says asita hayashar ve'atov. Like they're sort of more joined together. Like you don't really want to separate them. And then it's be'enei Hashem. Obviously, you have to do that which is good and right in Hashem's eyes, not in your eyes. But also, when you have the other instance of this v'hayashar, right? So now it's ta'aseh hatov v'hayashar ba'inei Adonai Elohecha. So now the order is switched. Now it's not ta'aseh hayashar v'hatov, it's ta'aseh hatov v'hayashar. So before it was hayashar v'hatov, now it's hatov v'hayashar. In both cases, b'inei Hashem. And in this case, it starts with the whole pasuk, Shmor v'shamata et kol advarim ha'ene asher anochi metzaveka למען ייטב לך ולבניך אחריך עד עולם. כי תעשה הטוב והישר בעיני אדוני אלוהיך. So observe and hear all these words which I command you, that it may go well with you and with your children after you forever, when you do that which is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. So you have Tov and Yashar switching order. They're not separated with et. It's in the eyes of Hashem and not in your eyes. And also both of them, in each of the cases where these appear, it's sort of in order that it be good for you, and it's over some stretch of time, so you can inherit the land, or because you and your sons will do that which Hashem commands, and it will therefore eventually be good for you. So there's some sense of what we said before, that Tov is about potential and passage of time, and this is about what Hashem wants for you, but ultimately it's saying, look, bottom line, if you want to know what's good in Hashem's eyes, you need to do hayashar, like you need to do that which is straight. And probably a lot of that is like following the rules, right? Keep the Torah. You need the Torah, because if someone just said, do that which is good in Hashem's eyes, how are you supposed to know what's good in Hashem's eyes? But then why are these psukim here? Why is Tov even mentioned, right? Why wouldn't you just say, do that which is yashar, like, stay straight with Hashem's rules, or just keep the Torah, do mitzvot, don't even mention Yashar. What is the point of this? So I think the point is, because a Tov and a Yashar, you switch order, clearly part of what it's saying is, don't try to pry Tov away from this and just decide to do Tov. Don't imagine you can know what's Tov and Hashem stam by itself. At some level, you need a system within which you're operating in order to try to do that, and you're going to learn that from the Torah. And you're gonna have a sense even of doing straight by Hashem according to His system as being the sort of anchor point for you, because Tov is so slippery and like it's hard to tell exactly what's good, and you're too likely to substitute what's good in your eyes instead. And on the other hand, the Tov is there because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to use your own judgment, right? That it would be a problem if it just said, keep the rules, and if you manage to find some little loophole where it's like everything is fine according to the rules, but you still are doing something that seems wicked, and now go ahead because it's fine, it's not forbidden by the rules, that has to be forbidden, right? So this is a stopgap in the Torah saying the whole point of all the rest of this is for you to learn something about what's good in Hashem's eyes, and then you are held to account for your judgment of what is good in Hashem's eyes, so you don't get to go and do that which you know is not good in Hashem's eyes, just because you found some legalese reason why it's okay in this particular case, right? So there ultimately is a place also for us to have the capacity to judge a little bit what's good in Hashem's eyes, and that's necessary in order to hold us to a higher standard, but it's not acceptable if it is for us to set the standard or to replace the standard that Hashem has given us with one that we make up ourselves. So Ra can refer to a fig that's bad that you wouldn't want to eat, and Tov can be about doing the right thing and seeking the good, as the psalmist tells us to do. So there is a sense in which we go back at the end of the day to our original notions of good and bad and say there is some sense to those meanings of the words. But what we get is a more complex picture where, on the other hand, Tov is very sensitive to the question in whose eyes, and if we all are interested in ultimate good and the potential that something has in Hashem's eyes, then we can't really derive that from first principles. We have to learn it from the Torah. We have to learn it by staying straight with a system that Hashem gives us to work within. And then once we're working within that system, maybe we get glimpses of how things seem to Hashem that are supposed to help us rise to a higher level and do better. And then with Ra, it's, it can be a bad fig, it can be something as simple as that. But at another level, Ra is about all of this kind of the ponderous weight of the collective perspective of it. Everyone looking at something and saying, this is impossible. There's no way it can be any way else, because we all have our eyes on it. And the more eyes are on it, the greater a ness Hashem would have to make in order for something different that people expect to happen. And the greater the merit that's needed in order to merit that ness, right? That all of these notions in Chazal of Ayin Hara, it's like that Hashem will bless a man when he's alone in his field, or that you can cause damage to someone's property by looking at it, that it's all because if a bunch of people look at something, every flaw will be discovered, right? But if the flaw isn't discovered, then unless Hashem wants you to have to deal with the flaw, you don't have to deal with it, right? That you could ride 1,000 miles in a car whose wheels are about to fall off. If you don't know they're about to fall off, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to make it where you're going, then you'll find out later the wheels were about to fall off, right? But if someone, before you set out on the journey, says, oh, we had 10 people look, and the wheels are about to fall off, and they all agree, then you're making a choice to commit suicide by getting in the car, right? So the perspective of individuals can have an impact on the world that at some level is negative when you add that up to some kind of objective judgment. And so we have both the association of the simple idea of bad, but then we also have this broader notion that Ra really is kind of a sometimes necessary and certainly structurally central feature of creation, and that provides the basis for some ways in which we are drawn to act in the world by just how one has to get around in the world. And that pulls us into it pulls us into sin or misdeed. And so we have to be aware of it, but it isn't ultimately something where Ra itself can be eliminated from the world, or that we'd want to, because Hashem is Borei Ra, and he put it there because it's part of his creation as a whole, which is, in his eyes, Tov Me'od.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.